Compartmentalization is a defense of sorts. It's putting conflicted, uncomfortable stuff into boxes and then putting those boxes into storage, which can protect the person against the anxieties and the conflicts and the issues raised by these conflicting situations in a person's life. Affair or family life? Do I make this shady business decision? Or do I do it honestly and not get the new sports car? Do I engage in have the scandalous behavior? Or do I want to be viewed as a family person? With the boxes, if you put those boxes away, the narcissistic person can walk through these more internally inconsistent spaces with ease because they've just sort of boxed everything separately. However, compartmentalization is not just about managing shifty moral behavior in a self-serving way. It's actually something that can even happen in survivors of trauma and result in a clinical presentation that looks somewhat detached and with a sort of restricted emotionality and affect. It's interesting because in narcissism, it's in many ways a manifestation of the more superficial level of emotional processing and functioning. That's what we see in narcissism, is that emotions don't get processed deep. The more superficial the emotional processing, the easier it is to compartmentalize. And because depth of emotion and depth of relationship are not observed in any kind of narcissistic relationship, it's much easier to compartmentalize these issues, right? When things don't go deep, you just sort of are like kind of getting these surface level issues. Things go deep, you'd need a compartment, as big as a mountain. In fact, some people will marvel at how they are in a divorce proceeding, for example, with someone, and the mediation is just soul sapping, or the court dates or whatever, just awful and insulting. And afterwards, the narcissistic person may calmly leave that room and say, "And what time was I supposed to pick up the kids?" In fact, the person who came up with the phrase, "It's not personal, it's business," first of all, one of the most narcissistic things a person could say, but that's a compartmentalization phrase extraordinaire. The narcissistic individual is able to compartmentalize in a way that they can look like a devoted parent or partner in a public situation, like a party or a school event or some other event. And then as soon as you're behind closed doors, the narcissistic person's able to take off the mask and go back to the full-blown rage and contempt. The challenge is that the mistake that so many people make in these narcissistic relationships is to say, "Oh, we're in a good period now. Like, we're kind of getting along." And people in those narcissistic relationships, because it's always so tense, will finally exhale. And then, boom, the compartment opens up and the rage begins. Okay, these compartments don't stay closed permanently. The narcissistic person's ability to put feelings into a box and push through also means that they hold other people to that standard. And as a result, because you don't have compartments, they may turn to you and ask you, "Why are you so dramatic?" when you continue to show emotion in the wake of an emotional situation. And by the way, emotion doesn't just turn off. It's normal to have a trickle of emotion to keep going on for a while. Emotion doesn't just disappear. But this compartmentalization is not just something that people who are narcissistic do. It is something we also observe in the survivors of these narcissistic relationships. Now, it's interesting because you wouldn't think that's happening to narcissists, how it can be happening in the survivors, but it does. And this is actually a manifestation of the cognitive dissonance. The good days get compartmentalized off from the bad days. And although the week before you were enduring gaslighting and rage, you will put on your happy face and be in the happy relationship when things kind of come back. You may learn to compartmentalize the confusion and anxiety and self-doubt and put on a big, bright, public face showing people a happy relationship, a happy family, a happy life. Survivors of narcissistic abuse are actually quite masterful at compartmentalizing, of putting the ugly traits of a partner or a family member in a box and forgetting about it so you can keep the relationship going. Now, in that way, many people in any form of narcissistic relationship may literally feel that they are in two different relationships, and compartmentalizing allows them to maintain the relationship or the illusion and not have to face down that the awfulness and the challenges of making life changes that feel scary or uncharted. So the practice of compartmentalizing, something we may observe in many, many people, and it's very, very common dynamic in people who are narcissistic or psychopathic, is something that can actually, something that can jump the rails into the lives of the people who are in these relationships. So people in narcissistic relationships compartmentalize as well. The compartments are a manifestation of the denial.
They do. Yeah, they split the brain in half. Of course, the brain is already pretty much split in half between the left and right hemispheres, but they're connected at the bottom by a bundle of fibers called the corpus callosum. So yeah, they just kind of cut those fibers. This made it so the two halves of the brain couldn't communicate with each other, which sounds like it would be a huge problem. But believe it or not, they went on to live normal lives. This surgery didn't change people's personalities or ability to function, but there were some kind of weird things that came out of it. You know, things like their left hand would start drawing something and they didn't know why. It's like there was something in their right hemisphere that was trying to communicate. They were kind of like two different people in there. So if that's the case, the question becomes which one of those two entities are, this topic is one of those things that just really caused this shift in like how I see the world, how I see other people, how I see myself. And it came from a book that I'll be sourcing quite a bit in this video, and I highly suggest you read it. It's called Who's in Charge by the neuroscientist Dr. Michael Gazzagna. This requires some explanation. As you may already know, the hemispheres are what they call contralateral, meaning the left hemisphere controls the right side of the body and the right hemisphere controls the left side of the body. Also known by its technical term, crisscross applesauce. But your eyes are a little bit weirder. It's not quite as simple as just each eye goes to the opposite hemisphere. They go to both hemispheres at the same time. What happens is the two optic nerves converge at a spot known as the optic chasm. And there they split apart, with one split carrying the left visual field and the other one carrying the right visual field. And then the left visual field from both eyes gets sent to the right hemisphere, and the right visual field from both eyes gets sent to the left hemisphere. So it's still contralateral, but with extra steps. So if you're staring at my face right now, Zoe is in your right visual field. You're seeing her blessing you with both eyes, but it's the left side of the brain that's processing that image. Your right hemisphere literally can't see Zoe right now. But it knows she's there because the left side is sharing that information through the corpus callosum. But what if you don't have a corpus callosum? This is what Roger Sperry wanted to figure out. So he came up with a series of tests along with his graduate student, Michael Gazzagna, the guy who wrote this book. Sorry, I just have to clarify one more thing before I get into the results of that test. A lot of the basic functioning of the body takes place in what's called the subcortical region. This is an area that's actually shared by both hemispheres of the brain. This includes structures like the thalamus, the hippocampus, the amygdala, and a lot of other things that you probably never heard of. But these kind of handle the basic stuff like motor control, sensory processing, something they call proprioceptive sense, which is basically our sense of our body's position in space. So that's handled before everything gets split up. There's no one hemisphere that controls that. This also includes what Dr. Gazagina calls an integrated spatial attention system, which is basically something that directs where the brain pays attention to things. So it's not like you could be doing homework with one side of your brain and gaming with the other side of the brain. That'd be nice, though. Anyway, I know that was a lot of exposition, but it's just all stuff you kind of need to know before we get into the good stuff. So here comes the good stuff. So one of the first patients that they studied was a man named WJ. They kept their names anonymous for obvious reasons. WJ's test started out pretty simple. They showed him pictures and words in a right visual field, and then he was able to respond with his left hemisphere. A dog, a car, a spoon, easy. Easy because the language center is on the left side of your brain. But when they showed an image in his left visual field that went to his right side of the brain, he claimed that there was nothing there. Now, this was a really big moment because up to this point, there was still a bit of a debate around how much the corpus callosum controlled the flow of information between the two hemispheres. And this seemed to be indisputable proof because it wasn't that the right hemisphere couldn't see the object. It could see it just fine. It's that the language center of the brain is in the left hemisphere. So it literally didn't have the words to describe it. So based off of this, they tried a new experiment, this time with a basic flashing light. So what they did was they put his hands under a barrier so his eyes couldn't see his hands. And he gave each hand a button. And he told him whenever he saw a flash of light to click the button and then confirm it verbally by saying light. So they signaled his left hemisphere, he clicked the button, he said light. Then they signaled his right hemisphere. He clicked the button and then said, hey, why did I click that button? He didn't see the light, but the right hemisphere did. And it was able to communicate that it did, it just couldn't do it with language. It's kind of like the left hemisphere has a voice and the right doesn't. But now they were figuring out how to talk to the right hemisphere. And now things get a lot more interesting. These kind of results bore themselves out over and over and over again with other split brain patients as well. Like in one experiment, the left hand was placed in a box with a handful of objects in it. And then they flashed an image of the object in the right hemisphere, and the left hand was able to feel around and pick out the right object. When they asked the patient why he grabbed that object, of course, he had no idea. And sometimes the patient could just draw the image. For example, they flashed an image of a bike at the right hemisphere of one patient, and then his left hand drew a bike. But think about the experience that the patient is having. He's just sitting there, he's got a pencil in his left hand, and he's waiting for them to flash an image at him. And he's waiting. And then his left hand just draws a bike. These experiments would progress and become more complex over time, and they began to understand just how different their left and right brains really are. You know how we always talk about left brain people being analytical and right brain people being more creative, that whole thing? Well, here's how the two hemispheres are actually different. Basically, the right hemisphere was better with visual and spatial skills, and the left hemisphere was good with language. Like he described an experiment where the patient was flashed a picture of a pattern of colored blocks, and then he had to recreate it. And when they flashed the right hemisphere, the left hand was able to recreate it really easily, so the right hemisphere was really good at that. But when they did that with the left brain, the right hand it really struggled with it. In fact, there's one story of a patient who was struggling to put it together with his right hand, and his left hand kept trying to help. He had to actually sit on his left hand to keep it from trying to help the right hand out to solve the problem. According to Dr. Gazagina, quote, the right hemisphere turned out to be specialized for such tasks as recognizing upright faces, focusing attention, and making perceptual distinctions. The left hemisphere was the intellectual. It specialized in language, speech, and intelligent behavior. There were also differences in logic and problem solving between the hemispheres. Like they'd show the right hemisphere a picture of water, and the guy would point to a picture of water. Then they show the picture of a pan, and the guy would point to a picture of a pan. But when they asked what they could do with those two items, the right hemisphere just couldn't quite figure that out. Whereas the left hemisphere knew right away that you put the water in the pan. The right hemisphere also struggled to come up with inferences. Like in another experiment, they showed a picture of a match and then a picture of a wood pile, and they couldn't quite figure out that the next image in that series should be a burning wood pile. And in another experiment, the patient was shown the letter U and asked to turn it into a square using a choice of shapes. And the right brain couldn't do it. But the left brain had no problem. Like the right brain is very literal. Things just are what they are. He uses the example of a box of candy. So like if somebody gave you a box of candy, your right brain would just be like, yes, that is a box of candy. But your left brain will try to figure out why they gave you a box of candy. What this means is that both halves of the brain are experiencing consciousness, but very different kinds of consciousness. As Dr. Gazagina puts it, quote, it was becoming apparent that the right hemisphere had its own rich mental life, quite different from that of the left. So right away, we can see that there's not just one consciousness going on inside our minds, there's two. Turns out, it's actually multiple modules inside each of the hemispheres that can display a kind of consciousness. And they have their own things to say. I'm trying to imagine what it must be like for these split brain patients when their left hand just kind of randomly does something beyond their control, how weird that must be. Well, Sperry and Gazagana were wondering the same thing. So they began developing tests to see how patients explain these actions. Like the left brain normally has a gigabit internet connection with the right. They're sharing everything. But now it can only get information from seeing what the brain does externally, from the pictures that it points to and the words that it writes and whatnot. And if the left brain is more interpretive and wired to find patterns, what would it interpret from that? Turns out a lot. So in one experiment, a patient was shown a chicken claw to his left hemisphere and a snow scene to his right. He was then asked to choose a picture that related to what he was shown. So his right hand pointed to a picture of a chicken, which obviously makes sense because the guy saw a chicken foot. But then his left hand pointed to a shovel, which makes sense because his original picture was a snow scene. But he didn't consciously see the snow scene. So when they asked him why he selected that shovel, he said, quote, "Oh, that's simple. The chicken claw goes with the chicken, and you need a shovel to clean out the chicken shed." The left hemisphere, without hesitation, came up with a justification for what the right hemisphere chose. It didn't say, "I don't know," which would have been the correct answer. It didn't say, "Oh, maybe it's this, I'm just guessing." No, it confidently declared chicken poop. And this was a result that repeated itself over and over and over again. In another example, the word music was flashed to the left brain, and a photo of a bell was flashed at the right brain. He was then given several images to choose from. These images were all musical instruments, by the way, including the bell. So the patient acknowledged that he'd read the word music with his speaking left brain, and then his left hand, controlled by his right brain, picked the bell image. When asked why he picked the bell over all the other musical instruments, the patient said, quote, "Well, the last time I heard any music was the bells banging outside here. There was a church across the street." Again, the left brain, having absolutely no idea that the right brain had seen a bell, confidently came up with a justification. One more example of this was an experiment where they flashed the word red to his left hemisphere and the image of a banana to his right hemisphere. He was then asked to draw a picture with his left hand out of an assortment of different colored pencils, so he picked the red pencil and he drew a banana. But when they asked him why he drew a banana, he said, quote, "It was the easiest to draw with his hand because this hand can pull down easier." Which, by the way, makes absolutely no sense. But that's what the interpreter came up with. And this was the name that they gave it, by the way. They call it the interpreter module. They also found the interpreter module hard at work explaining emotional triggers. So, for example, in one experiment, they showed the right hemisphere a scene from a fire safety video where a guy gets pushed into a fire. And the patient just reported that she only saw a white flash, but then afterwards she noticed a change in her mood. She said, quote, "I don't really know why, but I'm kind of scared. I feel jumpy. I think maybe I don't like this room, or maybe it's you. You're getting me nervous." In another experiment with a female patient, they flashed the picture of a pinup girl to her right hemisphere, and then, without knowing why, she kind of snickered a little. And when they asked her why she was laughing, she said that they had a funny machine. Like, have you ever had a random mood change? Like, suddenly you just get angry or sad, and you don't know why? There's stuff going on in there. And in case you haven't noticed, in every single one of these examples, the interpreter module was wrong. Often confidently wrong. It got limited amount of information and assumed it knew everything about it. Might as well call it the Dunning-Kruger module. And yet, this module is kind of running the brain.
Spell river.
R-I-V-E-R.
Okay, good. Now put a D in front of it. What does it say?
It's not a word. Driver? That's not a word.
No.
Okay, D-river? That's just an initial in a word.
Spell river.
R-I-V-E-R.
Put a D in front of it. What does it spell?
Driver. It's not a word, Wolfie. I have a college education, okay? I know which words, and I know driver's not a word, okay? So I don't know. I don't know what you want me to say. D-river, driver.
You're crazy.
You're asking crazy questions. You're going to get crazy answers, okay? Driver is not a word. Plain and simple. Driver is not a word. River's a word. D-river's not a word. Driver's not a word.
Honey, it spells driver.
Yes, it is.
Its further testing revealed that the interpreter module is just one of multiple modules in the brain, all of them kind of black boxes. Like, we don't really know how they make their choices, but they make choices, and then the interpreter module justifies it. Like, for example, fMRI tests showed that different areas of the brain would light up before a conscious decision was made to, say, take an action or to say something. That was a decision being made before the decision was made. This is basically how we live our lives, just walking around justifying the decisions and thoughts that pop into our heads from various random semi-conscious modules in our skull. This fact has been such a revelation for me because I don't really think of my thoughts and my actions as me doing it anymore. You know, I mean, yes, it's me. I'll get to the theory of mind around it in just a second, but it's a lot easier to look at your thoughts and beliefs objectively if you don't think of it as being part of you. Like when I have a thought that comes up, I don't know where it came from, so I can just ignore it if I don't like it. It's not tied into my sense of self. My ideas aren't my identity. And it's a lot easier to change your mind on something if you don't have it tied to your identity. Also, once I understood that our brains are just constantly justifying things,
What is an out-of-the-body experience?
What is it? Well, it's best described as a state of consciousness awareness that does not depend on physical sensory input, meaning it is acting separate and apart from your physical body. Recent studies indicated that 25% of the population in the United States remembers having at least one spontaneous out-of-body experience. There's been a lot of scientific discussion as to what that is, and our religions have given it a name too. But basically, you are able to exercise facsimiles is the best word of the sensory input that you have in the physical sense, in the physical continuity, as it were. So if you can think of that you are perceiving and separate and apart from this physical mechanism that provides you with this input, you're able to see, for example, and you are able to hear, that out-of-body consciousness, as it were, is able to be, let's say, 2 inches away from the physical, or if you want to put it at the extreme, you can go to Mars and cruise around Mars and see what's going on there. It's that unlimited.
Now, there are those who would refer to this as the astral body. Would that be a good term to use here?
Well, we don't like it, and the reason we don't like it is because it has sort of an occult connotation to it, in the sense that it was used in a time sort of prior to the scientific model that we attempt to follow. So we way back in the early 60s came up with the OB, out-of-body experiences. We were and are professional sound people. In other words, sound was our business, the production of sound in various ways. So we turned to sound quite naturally in order to do these things. First of all, in order to find out how we could begin to control the out-of-body experience, we began to use sound. Sound to affect consciousness. We soon learned that by using known brainwave frequencies and converting them into what sound amplitudes, not frequency, but sound amplitudes, we were able to induce sleep very easily and to stay awake very easily. And that was the beginning. Those are categories of consciousness. And we used that running frequency of amplitude to create a resonance by listening to it. And these induce various states of consciousness, basically. We call it a frequency following response because you can identify them by taking an EEG, a brainwave study, and see these particular patterns within the brain. So if you wanted a person to go to sleep, you would feed a particular system of theta and delta waves, and they would get sleepy. And then as we went on, we found a better way to do it, because these brainwave frequencies that are common in the human brain are of a frequency that is lower than human hearing. Let's use an illustration that here's an 8 hertz signal, which means 8 cycles per second, that we cannot hear. So how to get it into the human brain other than using an amplitude method? We found the binaural beat would work very beautifully in that respect. But in essence, it works this way. If we put a 100 hertz audio signal, which you can hear, and put it in one ear, and put a 108 hertz signal in the other ear, the differential between those two would be an 8 hertz signal. When we used that and had a person listen to it, the brain would synthesize that 8 hertz frequency. The brain wouldn't hear it, incidentally, but the electrical signals in the brain synthesize that 8 hertz differential. A slight variation of it as far as the Schumann resonance is the one that we as humans grew up with through millions of years, and it will create a form of physical relaxation. There are different kinds of meditative states. For example, years back, there was a great to-do about getting into the alpha state, and it was, let's get ourselves into alpha. Alpha is just a state of conscious relaxation, and we have not found it interesting enough to play with.
What about theta?
Theta is a state where a lot of creativity occurs in theta. It's great for ideas, word pictures, and things like that. The crossover state between this type of consciousness and the consciousness of delta sleep. Because of that, you are partially freed of the restrictions that are upon you during this normal wakefulness here. And as a result, you are freed, your mind is freed to perceive in ways it has not perceived before. And that's where a lot of meditation takes place.
So you like to look at this thing in a pragmatic way, I guess, scientifically speaking.
Very much.
All right, now let's say then pragmatically, what would be the purpose of an out-of-the-body experience then?
Well, that's the enigma, the question. That took me a lot of work to find out what value it had, if any. And the second thing is that through the years, what purpose? That's open to a lot of discussion. There have been all sorts of ways that one can use it and one does use it. I think the key thing is to recognize that we are firmly sure now that everyone goes out of their body during what we call delta sleep or deep sleep. But that's a sleep where you are at very low level of physical response. And it's that deep sleep that we all have during our sleep cycle for anywhere from 10 to 20 minutes and maybe sometimes more. We all have cycles of delta. We have cycles of an hour and a half cycle of sleep, a pattern we have all during our whole sleep period. But a part of that is the delta sleep state. And we sort of drift down to that delta state, and then we get there, and then we become totally inert. Blood pressure goes down, temperature goes down, and we respond very little to any external stimulant. We found in lab studies that a person in the out-of-body state resembles near perfectly the profile of delta sleep.
All right, now the difference, of course, is their consciousness. Is that right?
That's true. A person in the out-of-body state, by a peculiar kind of means of establishing still a relationship with the physical body, can report in while they're in the out-of-body state.
All right, now let me stop for a second. What you're saying is that people that you have worked with recorded out-of-body experiences. Is that correct?
That's true. Mm-hmm.
Those experiences from those people are such that they're actually able to respond while they are out of body. What do we know about that then?
They report what they're doing and how they're doing. Some very few, and it is few, you can communicate back to them. In other words, they're using their hearing and vocal means to, in turn, stay in contact with you. It's a learned thing, a thing that you have to learn. And not everyone can do it.
Now, if an EEG looks at a person who is talking to you during this state, does the EEG show delta still?
It shows delta superimposed with a beta signal, or a composite beta signal, that indicates a part of the brain is operating to do this communication process.
I know that's very interesting. I presume that was really interesting.
Yeah, the speech center becomes activated.
Okay, so let's come back then to this question then that I started out with. I'm sure, Robert, that this question was asked when, for example, Columbus went to the New World. People said, why would you want to go there? So I'm sure that this question is being asked now to you. Why would people want to do this type of research?
Well, I had to face that question all the way back in, would you believe it, back in 1958 and 59, which is a long ways back. I desperately need to learn how to control it, because I would suddenly move out of my body anytime I would lie down, and that became very embarrassing and very frightening, and I had to learn how to control it. Conventional science had no answer whatsoever for that. My close friends, psychologists and psychiatrists, didn't have the answer either. So we set up an R&D program in my company trying to find out answers for this. And one of the things that happened, it took, for example, a full year of validation and documentation of where I went and what I did and what I perceived in order for me to recognize that it was nothing more than an hallucination. So it's not that easy to transfer it from what might be a dream or an hallucination into a reality. It just takes that left brain of ours. It takes sometimes a great deal of evidence to convince it.
All right, are you saying then that when a person first has an out-of-body experience, they may not be able to logically understand what has happened?
That's quite true. And we rationalized it away because we just don't have culturally any answer for it. The best way I can describe that is, for example, that we now know that anyone who has a flying dream is symbolizing an out-of-body state. They can't identify it any other way, so they have a flying dream. And some people have to rationalize it by say they were in an airplane.
So they're actually experiencing the feeling of free flight,
Mm-hmm.
and then through the dream, they interpret it in whatever way they can through their logic.
Yes, and virtually all cases that we've encountered where a person has a falling dream, and that's re-entering the physical body. You can pick up hundreds of thousands of people who have had a falling dream where they fall and wake up, and that's re-entering the physical. Their interpretation of it, because they are totally unaware of it, has to translate it somehow so they do the best they can. Facets of out-of-body activity that has certainly been attracting attention over the last, say, 10 years. What is it? Something like 25 million people that they know of that have had it, and that's a near-death experience, which is a rather extreme version of the out-of-body. The one thing that certainly does with everyone who has an NDE, as they call it, is get them past the belief stage into the knowing that they survive physical death. That is a very profound piece of knowledge, that if you get that knowledge, it alters your life considerably. Now we have better and more scientific explanation for what's taking place. Think of it this way. You, I, at this moment, are very carefully focused in time-space. We have a focusing mechanism that we call a physical body, and it gives us all this heavy physical sensory input that gets us and keeps us phased into time-space. In other words, we're here. Our consciousness is here. Our mind is totally here. The moment that you stop focusing in that time-space that intently, let's call it inattention, just that much, you've become slightly out of phase with this physical time-space. This means that you are in thought, as it were, instead of totally there. And let's say that you're still 90 degrees focused in time-space and 10 degrees into something, somewhere, some way else. And then you have the stages called daydreaming, which are a little more out of phase. And then you have a controlled out of phase state, say, call it meditation, where let's say that you are 30 to 35% phased into another reality system or getting in touch with it, while you are still, great part of you is still in phase with time-space. Doesn't take much to follow that phasing relationship outward to where you get into states caused by drugs, alcohol, and things like that, where you are more and more out of phase. You get into illnesses, and they create greater degree of out of phase. And very innocently, we all fall asleep. And then we are, say, 90 degrees out of phase. We're still in touch with time-space, but our consciousness, our mind is elsewhere. So that's a real quick version of what we call phasing. This is, as we now perceive it, is a mass of phase relationships of which the out-of-body is one part of a spectrum. If you can think of consciousness as being a spectrum that encompasses time-space here on Earth and moves into other energy systems as it changes in pattern, so that when you are asleep, you are drifting even deeper into what I said, into delta sleep, where you are very much, say, 90% out of phase with time-space. And this means that you have an awareness, a consciousness there. The fact that you don't remember it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist.
Let me see. Am I going to guess that 100% is death?
100% is death, yes. And all that is very simply that if you have that wonderful knowledge that you do survive physical death, no matter what you do and act and be and think here, you are merely then don't have a focusing mechanism to phase you into time-space. It's all fallen apart, so you can't stay here any longer. Then you are there. You are there in that area past delta sleep. But you are there, you're conscious, you're, quote, awake, and you have means of perceiving there. And that's what the out-of-body state is a temporary visit there, if you want to think of it that way.
What is focus 10?
10 is a very specific state that might be called a meditative state, but we make it much simpler than that and keep it very broad range. We take a simple definition and say the mind is awake, body is asleep. The body is just detuned, actually, so that these heavy physical sensory input patterns are not interfering with your ability to think. People make quite a great discovery in 10 in the sense that they discover they do not need all of that 5 physical sensory patterns in order to be awake, alert, and full of mind consciousness, as it were.
All right, now what about 12 and 15? These are pretty spectacular as far as I was concerned.
Well, they do get fun as they go along. 12 is a thing that we've discovered and through the years, the state where once having detuned these other physical inputs, we find that you can begin to perceive in other ways. We call it a state of expanded awareness. But what has happened is that these other means of perception have been covered over or overwhelmed by all the physical input. And the moment those get detuned and you still retain your consciousness, you begin to perceive in these other ways. And 15 is an interim nice state, which we call the state of no time. It is fun because people have great expectations of what state of no time is. Not no space, but no time. The interesting part about it, of course, is that nothing is there. People get into 15 and have all these things they expect of it, when it has to be a self-instigating place. Nothing will happen unless you make it happen. You can lie around in no time forever unless you take thought steps in order to move in any given direction. And this is basically a very careful fear-reducing process so that you're not afraid of these unknown states. And the way we do it is that we prove very succinctly to the individual that he's only learning to control what he's been doing all the time. And it's the control factor that counts. So that when he wants to go to 10, he can do it because he has no fear of it anymore. There is a system of, let's call it helpers, that is a part of each individual. And those helpers are in continual service of that individual and are aimed specifically at that individual. But the interesting part is who they are. They are parts of you, and they are parts of you who have lived previous lives.
So the guides, for example, are existences that we have had and we are now, let's say, compartmentalized right now with a focus. One part of us is focused.
That's right.
In time, space, and the other parts of us are not focused.
That's right. And so you need a little help to fix a sore toe. Well, one of your life personalities 20,000 years ago knows all about fixing sore toes.
How do we get in touch with them? What focus?
Well, that comes out of 21.
That's focus 21.
Mm-hmm.
Are there other worlds, other beings? What are we looking at then there?
Well, what you're looking at, first of all, are the multitude of, when you get into this non-physical area of being, states of being, the first thing you encounter, of course, is what we call the belief system territories, where one is attracted automatically after they exit here by this phasing process because it's something familiar to them. And these are, of course, all of the various religions have a belief system that creates a state of being in this non-physical area, this non-physical part of this consciousness continuum. I know it sounds like a bunch of gobbledygook, but it's very simple.
Does that mean that if you are a Christian, you will come across saints and perhaps Jesus the Christ, etc.?
All of that, yes. That is one large part of this consciousness spectrum.
All right, now
so
that
is Buddhism, so is Islam, all sorts of it.
Now, and then you're saying to me that there are people who do not have belief systems, let's say, for example, an atheist or an existentialist.
No, they don't have to be that. They just
right.
Their intellect grows to a point where that's not enough. Would you like to spend all eternity lying on a cloud and strumming a harp?
Absolutely not.
Well, if you can get, and there are a lot of people more people than you would care to think, that are not, let's call it, entrapped in belief systems, then I get around to the basis of what's so stimulating and exciting about the out-of-body experience and becoming proficient at it. You realize there are a myriad of other options. And most of them make the belief systems look rather silly. Those options are so broad and so detailed. I can give you option number 1, which is a very, very common one, and that's to recycle and have another lifetime here. All of us do that many, many times because we have become addicted to being human. We like to eat, we like the sexual drive, we like the excitement, the fun of it, and all the process of being human we like so much that we got to come back and have more. And there's no law that makes you do that. That's the important part. It's you that wants to do this.
So people who say you have to come back because of your karma, You can undo your karma in other places.
And you don't need to undo it. You can undo it yourself by a simple twist of your thinking. That's all. And but you see, that is an option to come back. And each of us probably does that several thousand times, to get an idea. That's the one option, to come back and recycle. And setting the belief systems aside, then you've got this great span of the whole physical universe. And you can go and live another type of intelligent life on some other planet 6 million light years from here or something like that. We know of about 5 anyway already. But mind you, these are not human forms. That's the interesting thing to realize. They're nicely planned and nicely organized, very beautiful design. In their worlds, these are the dominant species, just as we are the dominant species here on Earth.
So really they're the top of the chain in that particular place?
That's true. Mm-hmm. So you say, I'm trying to answer that fundamental question. What would you do with being able to willfully, consciously control and move in the out-of-body state? You can pre-explore all these things before you do have a physical exit here. So do you have a pretty good idea what you'd like to do next before you are forced to do this, see? So after you've exhausted the physical universe, which may take an eternity if you want to get addicted there, can you see how easy you get addicted? The point is that these various other intelligent species mature, and I guess that's the word, just as we eventually mature, and we immigrate. And the reason we immigrate is because we've had all we can get out of this, and very frankly, you know what the real reason for immigration is? We become bored. And you can say, how could you possibly become bored? Because you realize that you could become involved here forever in finding out each electron and each biological pattern and everything else, and it goes on endlessly. So if you get a good sampling of it, and you find almost that, well, this is where I came in. It's a repeating cycle. And then, of course, the thing you're probably waiting to hear is, what do you do in a non-physical sense? That's the vista that truly opens up, because one of the things that you become aware of, that a graduate of this compressed learning human school becomes the equivalent of a god in these other energy systems. Because of things that we learn so naturally, we think are, well, they're just everyday stuff, is exquisitely valuable in these other systems. And as such, the temptation gets very great, not to be a god, but to do things in these other energy systems. For example, I reach and I without thinking, pick up a cup of coffee and sip the coffee and put it down again. That is a manipulation of energy, mechanical energy, electrical energy, and chemical energy, all connected with it. The ease with which we learn to do these kinds of things can be applied in other kinds of energy, can you see? And the other system that we learn so vividly, we learn measurement. It's so hard to understand that, well, everybody learns measurement. So we're a polarized environment. We have good and bad, or constructive or destructive, whatever labels you want to put. So we learn measurement. And that polarity measurement system, again, is very, very valuable in evaluation. What we really have, most of all, we take with us, and we do take it with you, is the thing we came to get. And that is, if we use the symbol left brain, that's what it is. Intelligence, the ability to analyze, calculate. All of that is what you came to get, and you take it with you. And, that's the stuff that is pure, invaluable elsewhere in these other energy systems. The key freedom is freedom from the fear of the unknown, and that principal unknown being what is beyond this physical existence. The moment a person learns that, it alters his life here so spectacularly, because all this, if you look around you, you find so much what you do is based upon fear. And most of it is fear of non-survival, one way or another. So if you can think of that as being a key thing. You also learn to accept and explore one's own self. And that self-exploration takes place, again, on the part of the individual, because once he is free of that fear, then he is free to explore his self first. Never mind all this other spectacular areas. Learn to free himself of all of the restraints that he had self-induced within him.
gamma frequencies orchestrated by Bob Holbrook and delivered through Monroe Audio Technology support and enhance remote viewing capabilities, out-of-body travel, and profound non-local experiences that add meaning and purpose to people's lives. Participants report expanded awareness that endures, not just to the end of the program, but sometimes we hear back from them much later on. And the consciousness expansion is lasting. Life-enhancing revelations during the program, relief from pain, and sometimes some actual physical healings. Everyone experiences mental clarity and integration, emotional peace and calm, heightened intuition, and profound mystical experiences. Because after all, as this graph shows, what they are doing is moving beyond time and space into the infinite, into other dimensions of awareness. And I'll need to explain this in order for you to understand what we're looking at. So the mind mirror measures an array of frequencies that cluster in these categories: delta, theta, alpha, beta, and gamma, all the way from 0.5 hertz all the way up to 100 hertz frequencies. And we have a completely unique EEG device. There's nothing else like it in the world. It's a dual hemisphere pattern measuring the left side of the brain and the right side of the brain. And the interrelationships of the frequency bars between each of these categories, and then the interrelationships of the categories themselves, which through 45 years of monitoring people and conducting our own research, we have discovered gives us an understanding of the actual state of consciousness. So changes in the pattern equate to changes in the state of consciousness. And I'll say something about this pattern here, which is called the awakened mind. In it, what you see in the orange and yellow bars, which is called beta, these are the beta brainwaves of active external thought. These are very quiet right here. You're not seeing a lot of activity which would relate to list making, decision making, stress, panic, anxiety, that sort of thing. None of that is in this pattern. It is downwardly curved and in beautiful connection with its relaxed, sensory, diffused, detached alpha brainwaves. Alpha, you just heard, is very much associated with healing. And indeed, studies have shown that alpha, actually theta, this combination of these two bars here, is where healing occurs. And you'll see some of that in this show. So alpha has a unique function. Function of serving as a bridge from the conscious mind to the subconscious mind of theta. Inside our theta frequencies, this is where we connect with wherever our memories are stored, and long-term memories, and something we call the essential being. Some people call it the deeper core self. Some people call it the soul. Whatever you call it, when people are in their theta, this is where they connect through their memories, often past life memories, with what needs healing. Because as the repository of long-term memory, our issues are stored here. But this is also where people experience their creativity and their insight and their spiritual awareness. The next and last category down here at the bottom in the purple is called delta, where theta is associated with dreaming, REM sleep. Delta is associated with deep, dreamless, restorative sleep. But in waking states, when we see delta, we know that what we're really looking at is the personal unconscious mind. Those frequencies that are like a kind of radar on an instinctual level that are searching for information, searching for energy, seeking to understand the world and other people through empathy, and also through psychic awareness. So when we see an expansion and amplitude, which is the width of this pattern, the power of the signal, then we're looking at someone who's either having a psychic insight or connecting with the collective unconscious mind. And we would call that the quantum field or source or whatever terms you use. It's searching far beyond self for energy and information beyond the self. And so what we have in this pattern, which Max Cade, the inventor of the mind mirror, back in 1976 found in highly developed and spiritually aware people, is an awakened mind. And that is awake to itself, awake to others, awake to its spirit, having access to the clarity of the conscious mind, the relaxed, diffused sensory awareness of the alpha bridge, the creativity, insight, spirituality of the theta subconscious, and the empathy and psychic awareness of the delta unconscious mind. In one program, Bob Holbrook and Ross Dunsby referred to our brainwave patterns as portals, and indeed that's exactly what they are. The awakened mind of creative flow and peak performance has long been associated with psychic awareness. In fact, it was found in psychics and healers, mediums, and other advanced meditators and other highly developed people. Interestingly, I captured these three images from a previous exercise aria during a discovery program. And this is the same person here that showed this awakened mind. And as the gamma frequencies and the meditations continued, this person developed that much gamma. And you can see the vast difference. This has 2 extra bands that you don't see, and this awakened mind pattern, which stops at 44 hertz. This gamma synchrony pattern includes 2 bands of what we call mid-gamma. The gamma synchrony pattern is called the superconscious mind because it's really about transcendence, love, compassion, mystical union, spiritual ecstasy, even the aha insight, a moment of revelation of, oh, I get it. And in fact, there's a synchronization between the brain lobes across the array of frequencies. This person is completely switched on. And you can note that this is an awakened mind pattern below, same pattern below this gamma. So this person's gamma is beautifully grounded in this theta and delta. And then this pattern in the middle is called the evolved mind. I also took this from the same ARIA recording, and you can see in the gray that this person is experiencing a good bit of upper, mid, and lower gamma, which we have found actually triggers these patterns, that the gamma frequencies and Bob's meditations trigger them sometimes gradually, sometimes suddenly, but they certainly do inform and stabilize the pattern. This evolved mind was until gamma synchrony the highest known state of consciousness, wherein the person lets go of the ego, surrenders to an experience of the field, source, and feels bliss, can feel radiance, sometimes an explosion of light in the energy system, certainly a feeling of oneness. Interesting that it's a circle, and non-duality. And what this is a 100 hertz evolved mind pattern going all the way up. So here we have union with source as high as we can measure in the frequencies. In this meditation, the meditator traveled from constellation to constellation, experienced the peace and perfection of Lyra, Vega, and their planets, and produced this pattern when he realized that he would be able to go to the planets and enjoy the trip. So this is a union of the heart, of the spirit, a moment of tremendous excitement. And you can even see that his gamma down in this composite display was arousing, decreased for a moment, and then he goes to the planets right there, perfectly visible in his pattern. He called this on the mystical scale an 8 out of 10, meaning that he went incredibly high. And we'll look at that mystical scale in a moment. But first, just to show you that we're actually measuring in statistics so that at a specific training level where we see advanced meditators, psychics, healers, mediums, people with extraordinary awakened mind scores, that they are measuring for the awakened mind between 75 and 100%. This person measured 89% on the 100 hertz scale, which is extremely impressive, and so is his gamma synchrony, 83%. Not so high for the evolved mind because he has a bit of a right brain dominance here. Working with some helpers, some assistants, and crunching the data to see what is the relationship between gamma and out-of-body travel and remote viewing. So, of course, we pay very close attention to someone who hits a target score 1. You might be wondering now, what is an 8 of 10 on the mystical scale mean? Well, this is for the person in a subjective way, their way of saying how high they were in the meditation. It starts with the loss of the usual sense of time and space, the experience that this was more real than your normal awareness, a sense that the experience cannot be adequately described in words. And then when you get to that state in consciousness, you may well be having the experience of pure awareness. No more sensation of your body. It's just you and your mind and spirit. Then might come the experience of unity with something larger than yourself, and which would bring a sense of awe or reverence, the experience of bliss or indefinable peace, sensation of being surrounded in light, feelings of universal love. You are convinced that you encountered ultimate reality. Now, we don't define what ultimate reality is, but when people encounter it, they absolutely know it. So what we found during this program, all the programs, is that the gamma waves that are embedded in the 40-minute musical meditations that people are listening to, an enduring gamma, and a gamma that opened like a portal to their being able to experience the meditation, not just on the physical level where I'm an animal and I'm perceiving things about myself, which is the intention of the meditation, but I'm an animal and I perceive multiple levels of understanding of my experience when they have this kind of high 80% gamma like that. This person also had very high gamma scores all the way through, which elevated their awakened mind scores. So this is really beautiful because what it's saying is that people's brainwaves are becoming more coherent, more ordered, more organized, more stable, and thus they are able to attain higher and higher levels of consciousness.